Brad, it's so good to be back in the room together.
And we're back for the Sunday Monday podcast.
By popular demand, I want to say.
Overwhelmingly popular.
But I think that's because you and I want it back, and we're the ones who are demanding it.
We've been fighting for it, but
That's
I'm
true.
excited about this series we're about to jump into. What are we looking at, Sam?
Absolutely. The book of Esther, preached across all our campuses over the coming weeks. And it's going to be so good to jump back in, take a deeper dive, look at some of the stuff around the book and the history to help people of Gateway really look at this book in deeper ways than what maybe they'll hear on Sunday.
Yeah, so we're going to have a similar format that we've had in the past, but we don't have Greek in the Old Testament,
No, that's
so we've
true.
got Hebrew instead. So,
Have you come up with a
well,
better phrase?
rather than geeking out in the Greek, we could do hotting up on the Hebrew. I don't
Hotting
know,
up on the Hebrew?
but we'll see how we
Let's
go.
keep working on that. We'll
We will.
workshop that a little bit offline.
But we are also joined in this series by a really special guest to the podcast and friend of Gateway, Tim Kay. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Brad, Sam. Great to be with you guys.
Now, mate, you have done some extensive work in the Esther book itself. Mate, why don't you just, before we talk anything else, tell us a bit about who you are, what you love about Esther, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Tim. I'm currently the senior pastor of Thornlea Community Baptist Church, which is a Baptist church in Sydney, on the north side of Sydney. Before that, we actually spent 10 years in Russia. We were missionaries serving God in Siberia. We lived in Siberia with our family, with our 5 kids. And while I was in Siberia, I really built up my knowledge of both the Russian language, but also Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and Latin. And so I was geeking out with the Greek in my house in Siberia. And it led to an opportunity to teach at the seminary there. There's a Novosibirsk Bible and Theological Seminary, where I was asked to teach a number of classes. But at one point, one of the guys at the seminary said, "Hey, Tim, can you come and do a 1-week intensive on a book of the Old Testament and a book of your choosing?" And so I went away and thought about it, prayed about it, and I decided I wanted to teach the book of Esther. So I then spent months studying the book, developed 60 pages of notes, and then taught this book as a 20-hour lecture intensive series, and it was awesome.
That's so good.
It sounds like we've got the right man for the job here, Brad.
Absolutely.
And it's great, Tim. We really appreciate your investment in our church through this series. And this episode that we're recording now, it's not related to any particular week of the series, but more of an intro episode. So here's my first question for you, Tim, as we think about the book of Esther. Right at the end of the book, jumping right to the end at the beginning, there's reference to this Jewish festival called Purim. Tell us about Purim and whether I've pronounced that correctly, and how the book of Esther has informed and created this Jewish festival.
Yeah, awesome. It's a really special Jewish festival, especially for Jews in light of the Holocaust. It was a festival that was banned, for example, in Nazi Germany, because it's a festival that celebrates the fact that God rescued the Jews from destruction. And so it's a very meaningful and special festival for Jewish people today. And the really interesting thing about it when we look at the Old Testament is that most of the Jewish festivals came from the time of Moses. So you find them in the book of Leviticus or Numbers, where Moses is instructed by God in how to celebrate what God has done through the Exodus. So, for example, the Passover. But then when you get to the end of the Old Testament, the end of the story, you've got this amazing person, Esther, who adds another festival in. And that's quite a power move, if you ask me. It means Esther is equal to Moses, at least in some way, in that she brings about another festival. And it's a festival that actually celebrates something very similar to Passover. It is God rescuing the people of Israel from destruction. So Haman kind of echoes the Pharaoh who was trying to keep Israel in slavery, and Esther echoes Moses.
That's very cool. I think how it has significance even to today. And I reckon one of the things, when you look at other people who study Esther as well, like Timothy Keller's got some work on this stuff too, he talks about that golden thread of the gospel, even through the Old Testament. One of my favorite kids' Bibles is got the tagline, "Every story whispers his name."
Yeah.
Where do we see Jesus in the gospel story in the book of Esther?
Yeah, amazing question. I think the main way that I see Jesus in the book of Esther is I see Esther as a type of Christ when she goes into the king and risks her life to save her people. It's a really powerful thing. In the Old Testament, there are a number of different people who act as a kind of precursor to Jesus. And the technical term, we say they're a type of Christ, like a prototype in a way. They're sort of like acting out a prophecy that expects someone to one day come and save the world from their sins. And so most of the types of Christ in the Old Testament are men. And when you ask the question, are there any female types of Christ in the Old Testament? Are there any women in the Old Testament who act as this kind of precursor that models what Jesus will one day do on the cross? And the answer is yes. And the clearest one is Esther. When she says, all right, I'm going in. If I die, I die. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to speak to the king. I might be killed, but I'm doing this to rescue my people. That is this powerful image of the gospel.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's so interesting. Like this is new stuff I'm hearing about Esther being as up there with Moses. It's really clear through Exodus and the story of Moses, and even with Jesus, that there is this deep intimacy with God expressed in the words of those biblical books and all that sort of thing. But the thing that I think most people know, if they've read their Bible at all, about Esther is that God isn't mentioned at all. Talk to us about what are the reasons for that? What's the context? What's the background there? Why is God not mentioned? And particularly, I guess, Esther's relationship with God, her own insight into her prayer life, insight into her feeling that sense of God's calling on her life. Are there reasons for that?
Yeah, I think we don't fully know the reason why God isn't mentioned. So there are different hypotheses. It could be that there was a time of persecution, and maybe this book was written under Persian rule still. It probably was. One reason that we think it was written under Persian rule is there are no Greek loanwords in the Hebrew text of the book.
Okay.
And so if it was after Alexander the Great taking over the world, then there would have been some Greek words in the book. So there are no Greek loanwords in the Hebrew text, which is a bit of a geeky answer.
Yeah, I love that.
So it was probably written before 330 BC, which is when Alexander the Great took over the Persian Empire and it became part of this kind of Greek world. But it is fascinating that God isn't mentioned. And I love that about the book because it's so similar to maybe people who are listening to this, maybe your workplace. You go into work each day and God isn't mentioned. And as a biblical Christian, you might feel uncomfortable with that. It's actually quite nice to go, well, even in one book of the Bible, God isn't mentioned. And yet he's everywhere present, working behind the scenes. It's also powerful when we think about aspects and times of our lives when we're struggling and we go, oh, well, where was God in this season? But then later you can look back and see that he was everywhere present. In terms of Esther's own faith, the moment when it's the clearest is when she, in chapter 4, is talking with Mordecai. And she says, all right, I'll go into the king, but could you fast for 3 days and get all the Jews in Susa, in the city, to fast for 3 days? It's interesting, the text doesn't even say, and pray. But whenever you fast, there's a reason for fasting, and that is so that you can pray. And so it's very clear that Esther believed in the power of prayer, and therefore she believed in God and knew that God was a key player in this story, even though he's not mentioned explicitly.
Well, that's really whetted my appetite for what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. So we're going to hear more from you, Tim, every week, and give a bit of expert unpacking of the few chapters we're looking at each week. And Sam, I can't wait.
I'm really excited. I wish we could keep going with this conversation now, but we just want to give a little taster to people of what's to come as we take a deeper dive into Esther. Tim, we're so looking forward to hearing more from you, mate. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Great to be with you.
And thanks for joining us for this taster episode of the Sunday Monday podcast.
Stay tuned for more.